everyone, and welcome to another monthly reads video, the series in which I review the books that I've read over the past month. So I've been getting a bit behind with this series recently, but I'm hopefully catching up now. So here we are with February. Now in February I set myself a really massive challenge to read Les Mis in 2 weeks. Well, I didn't quite manage to read it in 2 weeks, but it didn't take me the 6 weeks that it took me the last time, so I was quite grateful about that. Now, if you're not familiar with Les Mis at all, it's a French novel that was published in 1862 by Victor Hugo, and it's been turned into a hugely popular musical on the West End. Now, if you have seen the musical, you will probably be familiar with the rough story, and so there probably won't be any spoilers in this video for you really, because you'll know what happens. But for anybody that has no clue about Les Mis at all, there's probably going to be quite a few spoilers in this video, so may I suggest maybe reading up about Les Mis a bit before you watch this if you don't want it to be spoiled, or if you're going to see the show soon and you don't want it spoiled, then this isn't the video for you to watch. So Les Mis is a hugely important novel because it discusses a lot of social injustice and issues for the poor that were happening at the time that Victor Hugo was alive. But these issues still are there today, which is why Les Mis has that enduring appeal. Now, as I said, it has been turned into a stage musical, and like all adaptations of taking a novel from page to stage, there are omissions and things have been cut, especially when it's literally this thick. It's like over 1,300 odd pages long, so they had to cut things. They couldn't exactly just go, okay, we're going to take the whole thing and put it into 2 hours on stage without cutting anything. That would be impossible, so there are bits missing. But luckily, when adapting something like Les Mis, because the way it's written, there are a lot of tangents where he goes off and discusses like political essays around issues that were happening at the time. This meant that a lot of the plot actually isn't really omitted. It's mostly just the political discussion that's been omitted. But there are elements of the plot that are omitted, and if you do fancy learning more about Les Mis and learning more in depth about the characters, then definitely there are little bits of plot which are dotted throughout this that you don't get in the musical. So definitely would recommend to read if you do really love the musical, although it is difficult. It's a very challenging book to read because of the way it's written, the tangents it goes off on, and then just the sheer length of it. Like, you know, if it takes you months to read it, you're probably going to have forgotten what happened, and he refers back to it sometimes. So you kind of have to remember those things and just be like, why is this person going here and doing this thing? And it's like, oh yeah, because they left that there and they needed to go back and get it. So definitely is not one for the faint-hearted in reading if you've never read anything like this before. Might be diving in a bit at the deep end. But definitely is a good book to read if you really want to challenge yourself as a reader, and also if you just love musical theatre like me and want to know every little thing about the source material. Now, Les Mis is split into 5 volumes. The first volume is Fantine, which, although despite the name, it does contain Fantine's story, but it initially starts with the bishop and describing his life, and there's lots of tangents in it about different things in relation to the bishop. It then goes on to talk about Jean Valjean and a little bit about him, but he's quite a bit of a mystery in this first book really. It doesn't focus on him. It then goes on to talk about Fantine, and it sets everything up for her main story. Everything to do with Fantine is within this first book. It ends basically when she dies. Hugo likes to discuss the formulation of character a lot, so he likes to give you a lot of backstory and a lot of essays about what's going on in the character's thought process and how the character got that thought process without actually telling us what that thought process is, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So we sort of learn why the character acts the way they do, but not their own understanding of why they act that way. And we get a lot of backstory. It becomes very clear in this first book the way that Les Mis is going to be written. So basically it's broken up into essays on things that the author is just writing from their own perspective, the actual plot, and then backstory that we need to know to understand what's happening in the plot at that point in time. Or sometimes we don't even need to know it. It just, Hugo thought they'd tell us about it and that it might be interesting for us to know. So be aware, there are lots of tangents. They happen at random times that you can't really expect them to happen. I'd say the first volume, Fantine, is very plot and character driven. Although there are essays and things within it, most of it focuses on backstory and plot, so there's a lot of character in it. So in terms of that, I'd say this is one of the more enjoyable volumes to read. Now we get on to the second volume, which is Cosette. And this is where the infamous Waterloo section is, where we get a complete retelling of the Battle of Waterloo, not in order, and full of Hugo's opinions and ideas about the Battle of Waterloo, and then with a little section at the end actually describing something that happened that is relatable to his plot, which is the looting of the bodies after a battle. And this is the only little bit of plot that's in it, where you learn about Thénardier and how he was somebody that was at the Battle of Waterloo looting bodies. This section can get quite tedious, and if you're not interested in military history at all, probably would be a very big turn off for the rest of the novel. But luckily it is only 50 odd pages long, it's okay, it's not that bad. Once you've got over that, the plot does continue, and it looks at how Jean Valjean went to rescue Cosette, and her life with the Thénardiers, and how they moved from place to place for a little bit, until eventually they ended up at the convent. This then leads to a massive tangent of essays on convents and religion in general at the time, so there's a lot of reference to things here which we as modern readers might not understand, especially if you're not from a religious community. So again, this book is probably the one that drags the most. It takes the longest to read because there's so much stuff in it that just is not relevant to a modern audience in any way, unless you're looking at it from an analytical standpoint to discuss things that were happening at that time. Marius is the third volume, and we get back on track with the plot again here. There is a lot of backstory for Marius and his life, where he's not just this handsome guy that turns up. It discusses a bit about his childhood, and then how he fell out with his grandfather, and how he was living after his fallout with his grandfather, how he came across some of the other characters that he knows, how he met the guys at the cafe that he goes on a revolution with. So there's a lot of plot there. There are essays in between, just sort of discussing the revolutionaries and the students and their ideas. But it's not too heavy going. It's interspersed nicely in this novel, in this volume, I feel. A lot of the characters start to cross paths in this volume, which is where you sort of get the feeling of the plot moving quite nicely from, and I like that because it's sort of like, oh, I can see it all coming together now. Yeah, this is really good. And you know which of the characters were the ones that you were supposed to pay attention to that are going to keep reoccurring. And sort of like, oh, I don't have to remember those. And like, oh, it was good to remember that character because they've appeared again now. So in this volume, of course, Marius meets Cosette, and we sort of get a little bit of an understanding of their relationship, but it's very much one-sided. It's only sort of Marius looking at Cosette from afar. So we don't really get a lot of information in that regard. But it's nice to see that relationship blossom, and the fact that it wasn't just he saw her once and fell in love straight away. That's not actually what happened. He saw her once and wasn't really that interested in her, but then he kept seeing her again and again at the park, and he sort of slowly falls in love with her and becomes intrigued with her. She's a mystery. He wants to learn more about her, and that is how he ends up falling in love with her. But there's a lot of like funny misconceptions he gets about her because he hasn't really spoken to her at all. This volume ends where Jean Valjean ends up being accosted by the Thénardiers, and of course the police get involved. There's this whole sort of ruckus happens, and all the characters go their separate ways, and you're just like, okay, how are they going to end up all back together again? The next volume number 4, is the only one that's actually not named after a character, and it's called Saint Denis, and it's actually the place where the barricade is, because of course this is where the barricade stuff happens. This is where we get a lot of backstory of all the other characters, and we learn a lot about what happens to kick off the barricade and the revolution and all the things that lead to the climax of the novel, basically. Here Marius actually meets Cosette, you learn that they talk to each other, they share letters, and you get that whole sort of growing of their relationship, which is quite nice. And you get some essay bits, but there's some very long speeches that Gantier makes. That's probably the most sort of boring bit, when he just goes off on one of his rants and does this long speech. They're very important, and the stuff they discuss is quite interesting, but in terms of the flow of the novel, they really sort of bring it to a massive halt, because you think, oh, this is just going to be a paragraph, and then you're still there 4 pages later and he's still rambling, so that's quite fun, but not in a good way. Of course, most of the discussion in this part of the novel is focused on revolution and the idea of France at the time. We also learn about little Gavroche and his life, and that's actually really fascinating and something that I found very interesting to read about. That was probably one of the bits that I actually sort of felt that I was reading quite fast through, because I really wanted to know more and I was enjoying it and it was fun. Although it's quite sad and it is trying to make a big point about things. And of course, spoiler, if you do know what happens to Gavroche, it is quite heart-wrenching to sort of get so close to this character to then sort of have that sort of end for him. The 4th volume ends with a lot of sort of wires getting crossed and sort of all the things that happen in novels to make the novel move forward that don't always really happen in real life. So Marius ends up finding out where Cosette is, because Eponine turns up at the barricade and she tells him, and then he sends the letter to Cosette to try and tell her where he is, and Valjean gets it, and it's just this whole mixing up of people getting letters and they're not the letters that they were meant to have, and people sort of causing complications that they didn't really need to cause. The 5th and final volume is called Jean Valjean, and this is where we get another one of those really fun massive tangents where Victor Hugo decides we need to know about the sewers of Paris, their history, you know, the socio-political things that happen with them, and all sorts of other random stuff that we really didn't need to know. Because of course, Valjean ends up in the sewers with Marius and he's trying to find his way around them, so whenever he turns a corner and gets lost again, we get another tangent telling us, oh, this is this part of the sewer and this is the history of that part of the sewer, which is kind of fascinating, but after like 10 pages of reading about the sewer, it does kind of get a bit boring. So yeah, I know that Les Mis is supposed to make points about, you know, history and society, but maybe the sewer bit didn't need to be as long as it was. It does start with a ramble about barricades and about revolution again, which, you know, that fits in with the theme of it has to talk about socio-political stuff and that kind of thing, so that's not too bad. The main plot of this final section is that, of course, Marius is rescued, Jean Valjean confronts Javert. Javert's very confused by, you know, his whole ideology of life is questioned in the way that Valjean acts, and he ends up, of course, you know, creating his own end. And Marius gets taken back to his grandfather, they sort of reunite. He gets healed from all his wounds from the barricade and learns that Cosette has been patiently waiting for him this entire time. They start planning their wedding, which is actually quite interesting. In the novel, they do discuss a lot of the things that the readership at the time would have gone, oh well, how did they overcome this issue with the wedding and how did they overcome that issue? And Hugo does go into a lot of discussion at how Valjean had actually planned how he would get Cosette to sort of become legitimate and how she would have a life without complication and problems within society in terms of the law and the fact that she isn't really his child and her mother's dead and he doesn't know who her father is. So he had to kind of figure out a way that she could have a good life in society without this information that most people in the upper classes of society needed. It does get a little bit frustrating when people don't ask the right questions and people take what others say at face value. So Valjean tells Marius after the wedding, oh, he's a convict, he doesn't want to be there, he's run away, and that it's not good for him to be around Cosette. And Marius kind of is just like, yeah, okay, that's fine. You know, I don't really want you here either if that's what you are. Not realising that this is the guy that saved his life. And so Valjean sort of removes himself from Cosette's life slowly. He comes around to visit of an evening and then goes back home. And then Cosette, she's caught up in her new happy married life, you know. She's allowed to go out and do lots of things that she wasn't able to do when she was with Valjean. So she kind of forgets a little bit about some of these evening visits, and slowly they whittle down to virtually nothing. And then eventually she's like, she asks about him sometimes, but she thinks he's gone away for a bit, which she's kind of used to him doing. He used to do that when she was a child, so she's not too worried. But then of course Marius learns the truth of what had happened the night of the barricade and who saved him. He feels all this remorse. They go to find Valjean, but by then it's too late. He's sort of neglected himself to the point that, you know, he's virtually near death, and unfortunately he does die. It does seem a little bit irritating from one reader's point of view that he wouldn't just admit these things had happened and tell the whole story. Like, he chooses to tell the truth of his life, but only parts of it. And he's going for this sort of martyrdom, and I understand why that he does that martyrdom, but it does get a little bit annoying because it's like you could just retire into the quiet life and tell everybody who you are, but say you don't want fuss. But he's like, no. He feels like he has to atone for things, and he's constantly atoning, even though he probably has atoned 1,000 times over. Overall, I enjoy Les Mis. It may be a bit long now for a modern reader, with tangents and references and things that we might not necessarily completely understand now, not being within the context of the time. Like I said, it's a hugely important novel. It does discuss a lot of issues, which many of them are still relevant today, especially with the poor and the way we treat people after mistakes that they've made, and giving people second chances and not fully understanding people's reasonings behind things. If you don't mind a novel that's more of an essay with some plot added in every now and again, then you probably would enjoy Les Mis. I don't think Les Mis is one of those books that you necessarily say, I enjoy it. It's one of those books that you say, I learned something from this, I felt something from it. And that's the most important thing when tackling a book like this. At the end of the day, if you're just a fan of, say, the musical and you want more background information, then definitely read it. The films that have been made of it over the years, they again omit lots of stuff. Some of them don't even include half the plot. They like finish part way through, which is a bit random and I don't quite understand why. But it's just one of those things that happens. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments, and let me know what you think of Les Mis if you've read it, or any other musicals that are based on novels that I haven't already talked about. Let me know if you'd like me to discuss those, as I do have quite a lot of novels that musicals are based on, and I am a huge fan of musical theatre, which does influence what I read a lot. So as always, thank you so much, and please like and subscribe, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye!